Hello, today is the 12th of October and 2025. Following on my previous two videos, the last one on Freud, which I uploaded it for the general public, and the previous one on this priest that I told you about, Father Lorning, that I discovered, and I'm going through all his very prolific work. I thought that it does actually follow on the video on Freud to read to you one of his sermons. It's a sermon, actually, in the 1950s. And he's going to actually disconnect it. He's going to follow up on the same theme. He says, he starts first of all mentioning the passage from the Bible, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles? Thus every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." And then he says, the gospel read today is the conclusion of the Sermon of the Mount, and it deals with false prophets. Where are the false prophets today? Everywhere. They are the heresiarchs, the heretics, and the false teachers. Thousands of them. I already answered on another occasion, in another year, two small difficulties that this gospel presents, namely that the sign given by Christ, "By their fruits you will know them," to some people does not serve us well because it comes too late, they say. The harm has already been done. It would be as if we said, if you want to distinguish poisonous mushrooms from edible ones, eat them. And if you eat one and die, then that's a sign it was poisonous. That is how they understand it, how they interpret it. But Christ does not say that. He says that we should observe the tree still beautiful in appearance, though it has not yet borne fruit. And if it yields figs and grapes, it is good. And if it is not good, it bears thorns or deadly capsules. And what are those bad fruits? They are first the bad life and vices of the heretics, and second, the moral and even social disturbances that heresies produce. I know of the lives of dozens of heresiarchs, and I know only two who did not have coarse defects and vices in their lives. Bishop Janssens, or Jansenius, from whom Jansenism was born, and the Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin in our time, both of whom led outwardly correct and more or less honorable lives. Others, such as Pelagius and Molinos, for a time wore the skin of sheep, while inwardly they were ravenous wolves, as was later revealed. As for social disturbances, one need only look at our time, whose roots lie in the French Revolution and the heretical doctrines of the 18th century encyclopedists. The press calls the revolution still the greatest anniversary of humanity in the modern age. Yet the great historian Jacques Vainville once said that when he sees his countrymen celebrate the 14th of July, it reminds him of a man who would yearly commemorate the day he caught typhoid fever. Last Thursday, 1 million Frenchmen in Paris celebrated their typhoid fever because that is what they have been taught. What would you expect? Should every Frenchman become a Jacques Vainville and correct history for himself? He cannot. He accepts what he has been taught. And who teaches him? The false prophets. The other difficulty is that the heresiarchs of Christianity do not make prophecies. Therefore, they would not seem to be the false prophets of whom Christ speaks. The answer is simple. The Hebrew prophets were essentially those who taught religion, and within that teaching they made prophecies about the Messiah and about the end of the world, that is, the first and second coming of Christ. There are even prophets such as Obadiah, Elijah, and Elijah who have no recorded prophecies. The false prophets, then, were those who taught false religion, that is, heretics. But now there are no heresiarchs. There are no heresies, people say, because perhaps there is no longer faith either. This proposition must be corrected. We should say there are no heresies like the old ones, such as Pelagianism or Lutheranism, but there is the modern heresy, which is hidden, which sums up all the others, and is more dangerous than all of them combined. It is modernism, or naturalism, or progressivism, or whatever name you wish to give it. It consists simply in abolishing the supernatural and deifying the natural, which was first done by Pelagius in the 4th century. This central heresy is the common foundation or root of all modern heretical naturalism, of which there are 20 or more varieties. It has many heads, like the Hydra of Lerna, only that the Hydra of Lerna had 7 heads, and this one has 70. Many of these heads are even contrary to one another, apparently, and they clash and kick at each other. I had once made a list of pairs of opposites, such as the filthy optimism of Rousseau and the filthy pessimism of Freud, the furious atheism of Bertrand Russell, and the sugary pietism of Terrell and Loisy, etc., etc., but there is no time now for me to play the scholar. It is enough to consider, for example, liberalism and communism. Although in appearance there are only economic or political doctrines, in reality liberalism is a heresy, and our history gives abundant proof of that. Here the liberal politician constantly departs from the political plane to climb up into the religious one, to give sermons, for example. This is why he fails on politics, for to fail in politics is to fail in achieving the common good. And here liberal politicians have left our nation torn, despoiled, and unbound. The liberal politician in these lands, when he sees that his dogmas, that is, his ideology, are in danger, resorts to any means to defend them, even against the common good of the nation. He sacrifices the treasury, the good name, the future, domestic industry, the people's happiness, and even parts of the national territory, and indeed the entire territory, if it were necessary. These two, liberalism and communism, fight each other fiercely, and yet they share the same foundation: man apart from God. For liberalism, man is an animal rationalisticus. For communism, is an animal economicus. But neither of these two animals has anything to do with God. Naturalism consists in man's independence from God, and man's attempt to make himself independent of God is the very essence of sin. I will briefly touch on the two main heads of naturalism. In antiquity, Pelagius; in our times, Rousseau. I would also like to touch on the one in between, Luther, but there is no time. They are not, strictly speaking, traitors to the fatherland, nor sellouts, nor Nazis, nor stooges, according to the new academic terminology of today's Unitarians and Federalists. They act in good faith. They are right from their own point of view. Religion, of course, stands above all things. It's just a pity that they have chosen a false religion, the worst kind there is, a Christian heresy. Let us consider the nature of this heresy. Benedetto Croce subtitled his book on the history of European liberalism, The Religion of Liberty. And he was not wrong, quite the contrary. For there is something curious about this modern religion. It strives to ensure that its adherents do not know it is a religion. In that sense, Croce was quite right and behaved like a true philosopher. We have then that liberalism is a religion whose object of worship is liberty. Liberty is indeed a very beautiful word, but when written in capital letters, it becomes an idol. Over the centuries, men have made the sun and the moon, the planets, immortal man, the serpent, the dragon, the lion, the eagle, the beetle, the object of their worship. They even went so far in antiquity as to adore the crocodile. But it was reserved to our times to commit idolatry of a capitalized word, that is, of a mere flatus vocis, a puff of air, an empty sound. Monsignor Di Andrea once said from the pulpit that liberty is the greatest gift that God has given to man. It is therefore the absolute ideal of men and nations. It is easy to see that such a definition does not serve us because it pivots on the word liberty, which is an ambiguous word. It would have been better he was perhaps meant the same thing, but it's not the same. The two words free will, which is different, free will to choose this direction or the other direction. For in liberty, unless one adds for what purpose, it is a word without content. Liberty is not, properly speaking, a movement, but only the power to move. And in moving, what matters is the toward where. What determines movement, say the philosophers, what makes it small or great, good or bad, is its end point. For every movement has two determining terms, from where and to where. So take note of this. Liberty has no meaning whatsoever unless one adds for what. Without that, it is better not to speak of it at all. Pelagius was an Englishman. His name was Morgan, a surname which, translated into Latin, is Pelagius, meaning man of the sea or mariner. Pelagius in Latin means sea. He is called a monk, but he belonged to no religious order. Rather, he was what they then called an ascetic, a solitary, celibate, penitent man, but extremely proud and deceitful. He was a great orator and of striking presence, as St. Augustine tells us, tall, strong, blond. He went to see St. Augustine himself in Hippo, but did not find him. So he wrote several letters. He deceived him at first. Later, the saint became his chief adversary and annihilated him doctrinally in his 3 books, which may be called Against the Pelagians. The principal one being, on the grace of Christ and on original sin. De Gratia Christi e de Peccato Originali. It was the last great campaign of the Bishop of Hippo, that great unmasker of heresies. Pelagius simply denied original sin and the grace of Christ. So Freud was obviously not the first one. I talked about it in that last video on Freud. Then, as the churches rose against him, he outwardly admitted grace and Adam's sin, but only with his lips. For to him, grace was human nature itself, and Adam's sin was not hereditary. Thus he went on evading and distorting and dodging, causing endless trouble to 6 popes and some 20 provincial councils. His doctrine spread everywhere and endured for a long time because subtler, especially in becoming very subtler, especially in Gaul, among the semi-Pelagians. If Pelagius had been shown a modern naturalist like Rousseau, he would have fallen backward in astonishment, yet Rousseau was contained within him as a germ. For if there is no original sin, then grace is in vain, the sacraments are in vain, the redemption of Christ is in vain, and the church is in vain, amongst many others. Man is naturally good and need only, Rousseau said, man is naturally good and need only follow the impulses of his heart to always do right. Rousseau would later say 14 centuries after. To this theological heresy, which might seem purely theoretical, Rousseau added practice, that is, the corruption of Christianity. Rousseau was a weak, corrupt, and half-demented man. At the end of his life, completely demented and probably killed himself. Menendez Pelayo writes in the Heterodox of Spain that Rousseau was less of a scoundrel than Voltaire, but did much more harm. For my part, I find Rousseau much more repugnant, because Voltaire resembles a demon, and demons are clean. Rousseau, on the other hand, resembles a filthy swine. But I will not recount his life. It is unfit for anyone under 60 years of age. Men, he said, are born and remain free and equal. Human nature is good, and society corrupts it. Human nature, he said. Where did Rousseau get this? From his own nature, obviously, which he thought was very good. He is good, he was good, infinitely good. His heart, he says, is an abyss of goodness. Whatever he does, for example, abandoning on the streets one by one the 5 children he had, that was good because he feels in his heart that he is unbreakably good. Not only good, but holy, said his servant, Therese, by whom he had those 5 children. His prayer to God was this, in summary: O God, defend me so that you may deserve that I defend you. On Rousseau, one may consult my Human Psychology, chapter 10, The Delirium of Jean-Jacques. This aberration that so long as one loves God, one remains good, that as long as one loves God, one remains good, even while committing horrors, is a heresy from the 17th century. Quietism, founded by Miguel de Molinos. Molinos was a Spanish priest living in Rome who presented himself as a spiritual director. He had innumerable penitents, both men and women, and wrote an affected little book on mystical prayer titled The Spiritual Guide. He enjoyed great fame in Rome until it was discovered that he secretly taught that one could commit all kinds of carnal sins, that so long as the mind remained fixed on God, these were not sins. And he himself provided the example of this doctrine quite abundantly. Of course, another one was Luther. As for Molinos, the Inquisition imprisoned him and he died in prison. He was, in the end, nothing but a common criminal. Quietism was taught to Rousseau by one of his mistresses, Madame de Varens, but in truth Rousseau already carried it within himself, which within his supposedly good nature, though in reality it was mad, that is split in two. He had a sexual aberration and he had the split personality typical of schizophrenics. Madame de Varenne has rightly been called the mother of modernism. These two corrupted Christianity, turning it into a sentimentality, mawkishness, and a muddy self-indulgence. When Christianity reaches that state, it matters little whether the dogmas are outwardly maintained or not, having been turned into myths, whether beautiful myths or ugly ones. And thus naturalism advanced, branching into 100 forms, all sharing a common foundation, from religious indifference to famous anti-clericalism, and between these two extremes, every kind of error. Rousseau was born in Geneva and was educated in Calvinism, from which he never managed to detach himself. The Calvinist government of Geneva inspired his political doctrine. And so through the centuries, the heresy of the Antichrist was taken shape, the compendium of all heresies, which consists in the worship of man instead of God. It first renders Christianity useless by removing the supernatural, then it seizes the shell, the empty dogmas, keeping them as myths, that is, as poetic images of historical memories. Inevitably comes the third step, filling the void left by the supernatural with the natural, the substitution of God by man. For man is a being essentially dependent and feels his dependence. And if he flees from his true dependence on God, he will grasp at other gods upon whom to depend, and will worship the state or reason or science or aesthetics, the works of man, and finally man himself, under the name of humanity or liberty or the fatherland or whatever it may be. Therefore, in the face of this universal downfall, we must firmly, even brazenly, affirm the supernatural. Our salvation depends upon it. We must proclaim that we are all scoundrels left to ourselves, that without Jesus Christ we can do nothing, that God is terrible though he is also kind, that there is eternal salvation and eternal damnation, that without religion there is no true morality, that only God can save us from nothingness, and that nothingness is within us. That is to say, we must affirm the entire creed of things visible and invisible, with litany of miracles and mysteries. Precisely because I do not understand it, I believe it. For if I could understand God, he would not be God. I would be God. And then we'll all end up like Kirillov, the character in Dostoevsky, The Demons, when he says, if God does not exist, logically I am God. And to establish that I am God, that I depend on no one and nothing, I will now kill myself. Just as a note, Kirillov is a character in Dostoevsky's novel The Demons. He is an engineer and an atheist who believes that by committing suicide he can prove that man has free will and can become godlike by overcoming the fear of death. His philosophy is a literal and extreme interpretation of nihilism, which sees the absence of God as a call to create one's own values, though his suicide ultimately reveals a failure to fully live by his own beliefs. He agrees to commit suicide at a specific time to serve the revolutionary society's needs, but his deeper motivation is to manifest his self-will as a godless human being. His philosophy is a literal and tragic consequence of the nihilistic ideas of his time and of now, which claimed that life was without ultimate meaning or morality because God did not exist. And for Kirillov, this absence meant that anything was possible, and he felt compelled to act on this belief to its extreme conclusion. The philosopher, the novelist Camus, considered Kirillov's suicide to be a logical suicide, a necessary response to the absurd condition of living in a meaningless universe. Some see him as a deeply complex and even admirable character for his consistency in following his radical philosophy to its conclusion. Others are more critical of his philosophy, particularly Dostoevsky's own stance that true freedom involves acknowledging limits, not embracing nihilistic self-destruction. And to conclude with his words, again, if God does not exist, logically I am God. And to establish that I am God, I will now kill myself. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.